Past and Present is the title of this year's edition of Global Axess. Is it possible to draw conclusions from past events? Or is man doomed to repeat the mistakes of yesterday? How do authoritarian regimes use their own country's history to secure power? And what role does the individual play? In these interviews, researchers, journalists and writers try to answer these questions. The war in Yemen has claimed tens of thousands of lives and involves both regional and global powers. Despite this, the conflict is relatively unknown in the West. Elisabeth Kendall, an expert on radical extremist movements, talks to Thomas Gür about why the war in Yemen matters.
So, the situation in Yemen, why does it matter?
Well, Yemen seems on the surface probably not to matter because it is the poorest country in the Arab world and it has very little oil. But it's quite populous. It has a population of about 28 million. And more importantly, half of them, roughly, are under the age of 18. So it is a time bomb. And when we look at where it's located, with a very porous coastline of about 2,000 kilometres, a long border to our ally, Saudi Arabia, about 1,500 kilometres, 300 kilometres to Oman, and then the southern maritime border is to Somalia. That Gulf of Aden part of the ocean under Yemen is also the access point to the Red Sea through the Bab el-Mandeb. So it's a very important trade route and shipping route. If this corner of the Arabian Peninsula implodes, fragments, or spills over, that will affect global trade as well as stability in our allies' countries. So we should care.
Yes, but also I think we should care due to the humanitarian situation.
The humanitarian situation is dire, you're right. In a sense, I haven't mentioned that because it's the part that always gets wheeled across our television screens and newspapers, and it's the part that governments like to be seen to be doing something about. After all, we've got about 24 million Yemenis, 80% of the population, who need humanitarian assistance. We've got 10 million who are starving, and we have 2 million of children out of school. 85,000 children have already starved to death, and over 1 million cases of cholera. So it's in a terrible situation. But in a sense, addressing that humanitarian crisis is not getting at the roots of the conflict. It's easy for governments to talk about, oh, we've given this much money or that much money, but they're not getting at the conflict, at the things that are actually causing that situation. Anything we do about that is important, but ultimately it's a Band-Aid on an open wound.
So do we have to point to the strategic importance and the consequences an implosion of Yemen can have in order to be able to address the humanitarian situation? Are we just using the strategic arguments in order to concentrate on the humanitarian issue? Or is that the pretext, or is the strategic implications for real?
Well, I think what's happening is that when governments want to be seen to be doing something about this Yemen war, which has now gone on over 4 years, it's in its 5th year, they point to the humanitarian situation and what they're doing to help alleviate it, because it avoids the awkward questions about how are we aiding and abetting those pursuing this war by continuing to sell them weapons. So, of course, you don't really want to get into those arguments. It's much easier to talk about the humanitarian crisis.
The root of the conflict is domestic.
Right.
We'll get into that, but first I think we have to clear up the foreign interventions and foreign troops on Yemenite soil. It is, in a way, like a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That's actually how it's many times described in the Western press.
That's right, Thomas. This was a domestically generated conflict, but it is no longer just a domestic conflict. As you say, there are many foreign powers now playing out their own wars inside Yemen and using Yemen. So I guess the two main players would be the proxy conflict you've mentioned, which is between Saudi Arabia on the one hand, the Sunni bloc that it has in its coalition originally nine Sunni countries. Qatar, of course, left. There's questions over Morocco's inclusion now as well, so let's call it 7. And on the other hand, we have the Iranians supporting, to some extent, the Houthis from Yemen's north who came and took over the capital in 2014 and eventually led to the Saudi intervention in 2015. So we've got these two big powers thrashing it out in Yemen. We also have other lesser conflicts going on. There's a battle for influence in the east of Yemen, for example, between Saudi, who drove into the east in December 2017, and Oman. There's also potentially some discord inside the Saudi-led coalition between the ultimate war aims, ambitions, and long-term goals of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi. And amid all of that, we've got Western powers such as the United Kingdom, the United States, and France in particular, supporting the Saudi-led coalition, not just by selling them weapons, but also by providing military assistance and intelligence support. So we're heavily involved as well.
And the reason why the Saudis are supported by the West is the fright of the Iranian support to the Houthis you mentioned. Is that an explanation, or does the West have other interests or other strategic interests?
That's a good question. Certainly the public argument is that we are supporting Saudi Arabia and its coalition in Yemen in order to restore the so-called legitimate government of President Hadi, and also to balance out and to try to push back the influence of Iran in the region. Now, it is unlikely that Iranian influence was very strong. It was there, but it was not very, very strong at the beginning of this war in 2015. Certainly vocal support was there. But actually, Iran's interests were served partly by the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had been in power until the Arab Spring, actually going over to the Houthi side. And he took with him probably about 2/3 of military hardware and about 60% of personnel, well-trained. So the Houthis didn't actually need that much Iranian weaponry support advisors at the beginning of the war. They already had a lot of material.
So to go into the domestic issue and the Saudi Arab interest, because as I have come to understand it, the Saudi Arabian interest is also linked much more to the domestic issue, because the Saudis actually occupied 3 provinces close to the Saudi border. They were very clear from the beginning that they wouldn't tolerate the Houthi government of Yemen. So, in a way, the Saudi intervention was based on the domestic conflicts within Yemen, I guess.
That's right. And Saudi Arabia actually had come in already, as you mentioned, in the last of 6 wars that the Houthis had already fought against the Yemeni government between 2004 and 2010. Saudi was involved in the final one of those. But you make an important point, because the Saudi intervention was, and we must make this point, at the request of the so-called legitimate government of Yemen. It wasn't as though Saudi decided to go and invade a neighbouring country in order to get more territory. Saudi was asked to intervene, and the fear internationally, not just by the Yemeni government, was that if it didn't, the Houthis would just overrun Yemen, and they were not popular, particularly in the south, and that had to be prevented. So there were legitimate reasons for getting involved in the war. The problem is that the war is not achieving its stated aims. Saudi had 3 public war aims. It wanted to contain the influence of Iran. Iranian influence has been growing, not declining. Saudi Arabia wanted to protect its southern border. Its southern border is more porous than ever. There's missiles strike just recently that actually hit civilians inside Saudi Arabia. And then thirdly, it wanted to restore the Hadi government and prevent Yemen from fragmenting. Yemen is fragmenting,
yes.
and Hadi lives in Saudi Arabia, so it's failing.
To just go back to Yemenite history and to be able to move forwards, can Yemen be a unitarian state or a state that, well, it's obviously not a homogeneous state, so it can't be unitarian in that sense, but can Yemen hold together as a state? I mean, once we had South and North Yemen, as I remember from the maps of my childhood.
We did. Yemen is an awkward concept as an integrated single state. It only emerged, actually, even into North and South components in the 1960s from a whole collection of sultanates, sheikdoms, and an imamate in the north and all sorts of tribal enclaves. And even those two units, North and South, were problematic. So they came together in 1990 to form the Yemeni single state. But within 4 years, they were already at war. So I think your question is key. Yemen doesn't hang together very well as a single state with a single government. On the other hand, do we really want to deal with dozens of smaller states? That's also awkward. I think the best solution would be federal regions. But this is precisely what the Yemeni government tried to draw up when the Houthis were provoked into kidnapping, actually, the chief of staff and holding the government to ransom because they were so unhappy with the federal region plan that President Hadi had drawn up. And frankly, other regions were unhappy too. There were 6 proposed bits of Yemen, and the Houthis were left without any access to oil and without any seaport. So they had no resources, and their region, after 6 wars, was already pulverised. Of course they weren't going to accept it. So what needs to happen, I think, is a discussion of Yemen's regions that actually involves stakeholders in those regions who have buy-in from local communities and are qualified to speak for them, rather than just some committee of 14 people sitting somewhere at the appointmentship of the president who draw up the federal regions according to his wishes and not the people's wishes.
But in order to get there, I guess one has to cope with, first of all, the Saudi intervention, which is now, I think, turning more or less as a warfare against the civilian population.
It hasn't worked out well. There have been very close, at this point in time, when we're filming this, to 20,000 Saudi airstrikes. About 1 in 3, according to the Yemen Data Project, has hit a civilian target. That looks like something more than just incompetence. And certainly it's going to make this country incredibly difficult to get back on its feet because the infrastructure is being destroyed, not just the military capabilities of the Houthis. And of course, what this is ultimately doing is creating a lost generation. Imagine you're 15 years old. Since the age of 10, you've only known war, and you're probably not in school. And if you are in school, your teacher might not be getting paid, so your lessons aren't going to be very valuable. Who's going to rebuild this country? I think this is my biggest concern, is what about this youth time bomb that we mentioned at the beginning? The longer this intervention goes on and peace is not negotiated, a political settlement is not found, it continues to be a military punch-up, then the longer and more intractable this conflict becomes.
Are these Saudis, in a way, the key issue that one has to understand in Riyadh, that you cannot go on conducting the Yemenite war as they have done until now? Will they be able to, does it need American pressure, or will they be able to understand it themselves and try to find another way of solving the issue?
I think it does require international pressure. Now, of course, the Saudis need some way of declaring victory and pulling back, but without just handing the country over to the Houthis. No. So there needs to be compromise. It's not going to be possible to exterminate this entire Houthi power base and population. either by starving them or by bombing them. It's not going to work because they are part of Yemen. Now, the Houthis have done despicable acts. They have violated human rights. They've been responsible, actually, for some of this humanitarian crisis. Saudi gets all the blame, but actually the Houthis have mismanaged government. They haven't, for example, collected rubbish. Cholera has spread. They hoard food. They don't let it go to some of the most in-need populations. They use it as a weapon. So it's not fair to blame Saudi entirely for the crisis, for the humanitarian crisis. But they need to be given something that enables them to start running their affairs in the north of Yemen, that's this region that's totally destroyed. It needs investment. They need a seaport. It cannot be a negotiation which has the Houthis give up all their weapons and withdraw.
If one should take a more cynical position, which is not my personal, but just as a thought experiment, can the war be contained in a sense that they can go on for 30 years and unfortunately slaughter each other, but their risk of spreading to other countries can be minimized? I mean, this is a very cynical question. I'm fairly aware of that, but one has to ask those cynical questions as well, I guess.
Well, it is a cynical question, and it's also a valid question. I think, however, because of the location of Yemen that I've mentioned and now this is a cynical answer, but the risk to commercial shipping routes, oil transport, I don't think that that's really a possibility, especially now with the Houthis' more sophisticated weaponry that has been showing up over the past few months. And the targeting with missiles and drones of Saudi and UAE airports and of oil tankers. I think this needs to be solved, and it's very unlikely that it won't spill over. I would also say that morally, the argument of this young, hopeless, lacking in aspirations population in Yemen can't just be left unaddressed, particularly in a region where we do have a persistent problem of militant jihadist extremism. Yeah. It's just too dangerous not to solve.
Because there is even a part of Yemen, a territory that is controlled by Al-Qaeda. And a mini-statehood, not like the ISIS in Syria, but more or less there's an Islamic state of their own.
That's right. The war in 2015 coincided absolutely precisely with the launch of a state in the east of Yemen by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, that state really only lasted a year, until April 2016, when United Arab Emirates Special Forces, with a bit of help from their colleagues, managed to oust it. But they didn't annihilate it, they didn't kill it. And these stories that went around the Gulf press of 800 Mujahideen killed were fabricated. They withdrew. And so what that means is that they're still around, the militants, under the fabric of society. They've gone to ground, but they're not out. And they could easily resurge again. Actually, I think the most dangerous time could be a peace deal, because that sounds counterintuitive, but when peace actually occurs between the two major warring sides, that means
opportunistic third parties could use it for their own.
That's right. And also there'll be lots of sectors of the population who are disillusioned. Oh, we weren't really included in this peace. Or we don't have a mutual enemy, the Houthis, to fight with anymore. So now let's fight amongst ourselves. And all of these little local grievances, feuds, tribal rivalries that go back through history can be latched onto by militant jihadists and fed into their narrative of global jihad. That's what happened before.
Just in order to develop on our knowledge and understanding of Yemen, and this is also part of a personal question, very few Westerners travel in Yemen and try to understand the conflict. You are traveling in Yemen as a Western woman. And I mean, how do you dare to do that? And what type of experiences do you have from that? And
I should start
isn't it?
Well, I should start by saying I have built up a relationship over several years before the war with local tribes, particularly in the east of the country, partly through my work on Arabic poetry and culture.
And jihadist poetry.
Well, jihadist poetry as well, right. And so actually getting under the skin of the culture has been very helpful in forming relationships. But you see, I have tried very hard also to listen to some of these local communities and assist them in trying to achieve some of their aspirations. I have a peacebuilding program that I'm helping with in schools. We're in 28 schools in the east of the country. The NGO that I work with, it's a grassroots local one in the east of Yemen, tries to navigate between tribes. We have an intertribal camel race, for example, football competitions for the kids. There's lots of things that I try to do with the communities. But most of all, I never take any money with me, ever. And I don't pay for anything. Everything is as a guest. They're such a hospitable people. So I never pay for food. I never pay for accommodation. I'm always hosted, and that makes me safe.
And I guess those sports events, camel races and so forth you mentioned is a part of also trust-building process among common people in a way. And that's how usually peace processes start, with ping-pong diplomacies. And
I think that's right. And actually that's very much something that we're missing at the moment, partly because of the security situation. I understand that the United Nations can't send out teams to go and join in camel races, etc. But we don't have that local perspective anymore, that local knowledge, that, oh, let me explain why these people are warring, and why they won't listen to any peace consultations that are happening in Stockholm or elsewhere, because there's this long historical feud going on, and that's been fed into their motivation for fighting on this side or that side. There's so much more to it, and we just don't peel back those layers anymore.
You mentioned actually Stockholm, and that was not just by happen chance. There was actually a Stockholm Accord in December 2018.
That's right.
Among the principal warring parties of Yemen, and they actually met in Stockholm.
Yeah.
There was a very small peace agreement, you could say. Could we just dwell upon it? Is that a way of going forward? Because it was also criticized in the sense that it was so minimalistic that it could be ignored. But well, one has to start somewhere, I guess.
That's right. And first, I think it's important to congratulate Sweden on having achieved this, because there had been no peace talks at all for 2 years. And the previous ones had broken down in Kuwait in August 2016. They lasted for 108 days and they got nowhere. So the 7 days that you had in December 2018 in Stockholm actually got these two main warring sides talking. That was an achievement in itself. Now, what came out of that, you'd have thought from all the handshakes and smiles and back-smacking that this was peace. Of course it wasn't. They were called consultations, not peace talks. And the agreement, the Stockholm Agreement, really was very minimalist.
It's just one page. I looked up.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. It's a page. And there were 3 parts to it. There was the ceasefire for Hodeidah.
Yes, which is in harbour.
Which is, it's a port. It's an important port because lots of aid comes through it, but it's just one front line and many front lines. There was an understanding for another battlefront called Taiz, but that's really gone nowhere. And there was a prisoner swap, which also hasn't materialised. And actually, the Hodeidah agreement, it was never about demobilising. It was always about redeploying forces. So it wasn't getting rid of the military. It was simply taking them out of the port and putting them somewhere else. And there's a little argument about whether that has or hasn't happened. The Houthis claim that they did indeed withdraw in the middle of May, and the United Nations is supporting that claim. But the coalition side, and in particular the Yemeni government, is saying, no, You just swapped your uniforms. You haven't left the port at all. So it's difficult to know whether we've had much progress on the Stockholm Agreement. What we can say is, to some extent, for 6 months, it stopped an even worse bloodbath, and we have to be grateful for that.
But since it's such a small step, and you need much larger steps, and then on the other hand, you have this humanitarian catastrophe, will we be able to move in a pace that catches up?
I think the question that you're asking is that $60 million question. What do we do? What should we be doing? And how can we broaden out from the Stockholm Agreement? Well, I think we need the next round of talks immediately. The idea was that when both sides had agreed that Stockholm had been implemented, at least begun, then we would move to the next round of talks. Actually, we need to move to the next round of talks right now because, as you said, the detail in the Stockholm Agreement was so imprecise, absent, that it's almost impossible to implement. Who are the local forces who are supposed to take over the port? We just don't know. That needs talks. So obviously talks need to happen. But the other thing that needs to happen is some really hard thought about how to stabilise Yemen and all those little feuds and historical rivalries that I'm talking about now. Because even the government side, these are not pro-government forces. These are lots and lots of different religious, tribal, southern militias, mercenaries, who are anti-Houthi. They're not pro-government. And so this conflict could easily fragment. We need stabilisation measures now and not try to wait for some kind of peace before we begin these youth projects, education projects, women's empowerment projects, and I mean that genuinely, not just a throwaway term, and actually building up the economy again. All of this needs to happen before the end of the war.
Is there an understanding in London and Washington of the importance of the conflict in political terms? What would you say?
I would say that it's not very high on the agenda. And the reason for that is obviously in the United Kingdom, we're a little bit obsessed by who's going to lead us out of our Brexit dilemma. And that's taking a lot of time. And in the United States, of course, the Trump administration has its own worries. So I think keeping a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, on both of those countries, is pretty high up their list of priorities. And therefore, perhaps the amount of pressure that needs to be brought to bear to get the compromises necessary to start bringing this conflict to an end are not going to happen. That kind of pressure, there's no appetite for it at the moment.
Which means that it has to come from some other source.
Are you offering Sweden?
Well, I think Sweden has made some progress in the area, but do you think that Sweden could be a key player?
I think Sweden has played an excellent role so far and that it could continue to do so. I think the United Nations has played a very positive role, especially under Martin Griffiths, the latest United Nations Special Envoy. But of course, that's a very problematic structure with all these countries that have to be kept together in the Security Council. It's easier for a country like Sweden to take the lead. And I would also like to stress the very important potential of Oman. Oman did not join the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. It has kept a neutral role. It has lines open to Iran as well as to Saudi. And it has a policy of trying to mediate, trying to find palatable solutions for all sides. I think it's a voice of reason in the region.
So let's hope that Oman and Sweden can be that. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.